This session is going to be looking at what London and our other great cities need to thrive in the future. And our panel will be focusing on what our city and other great cities need to thrive in the future, particularly in the context of Brexit, demands for further fiscal and service devolution, and for investment in infrastructure, transport and housing. And amazingly, we're throwing off our London-centric shackles, and we've got someone from the north joining us. I don't know what's come over us. But I'm delighted that our panel is made up of Councillor Sean Anstee, who is the leader of Trafford Council. Sean is also the Trafford representative and a vice chair of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. He holds the portfolio for skills, employment and apprenticeships. He's deputy chair of the Local Government Association, which obviously we know is the national voice of local government, deputy leader of the LGA Conservative Group. He's recognised by the Local Government Chronicle. I'm not sure about the MJ. The Local Government Chronicle recognised him as one of the 100 most influential people in local government, Heather. And he's a keen marathon runner. Next to him sits Jasmine Whitbread, who is the Chief Executive of London First. Jasmine has been in that role since December of last year, and she has a unique combination on her CV of both private enterprise and the voluntary sector. She came to London First. Previously, she was the CEO of Save the Children for 10 years. First turning around Save the Children UK, then bringing together all the members of the Federation to create Save the Children International. And that's 25,000 staff in 120 countries. So Jasmine's also a non-executive director of BT Group and of the Standard Chartered Bank, where she chairs the Brand, Values and Conduct Committee, which is very W1A, isn't it, Jasmine? And finally making up our panel, Kru Desai, who's a partner at KPMG. She's had a 20-year career there, including advising UK and international, national and regional governments, health authorities and private sector providers in improving the performance of public services through systems, including technology-enabled transformation programs. She rejoined KPMG in July 2010 from a FTSE 250 business service provider and started her career back at Westminster City Council in the early 1990s, where she served in a number of policy development and operational roles. I have no information about either Kru or Jasmine's marathon running habits, but we may hear about that in due course. So going to kick off our panel with Jasmine, who's going to talk for a little while about business, Brexit, and what the whole future holds, and answering the exam question of what London and other great cities need to thrive in the future. Over to you, Jasmine.
Thank you very much. So when I joined London First a little under a year ago, and it was obviously well into the reality of the result of the referendum having sunk in, and I went out to talk to all of our chief exec members, partner members, and obviously I looked at our latest member survey in terms of what are the top issues that our membership is concerned about 240 of the largest employers in London across all sectors. And I was actually quite surprised, quite a sophisticated city here, with a whole range of trends coming in from the future towards us, and I thought there might be a really complex range of issues. I thought tax might be up there. And actually, what was the top three issues is pretty much what we've talked about this morning. And it's, first of all, people, where they live and how they get about. And that is what business leaders are most concerned about in terms of, for today, but also London's competitiveness into the future. So first of all, on people, I think this has always been an issue, access to talent and global talent from around the world, and also skills, and recognising the business's responsibility to do more about the parts of London, the unemployment rates, particularly amongst young people. So I think that was always there as a lower level issue, but I think that the results of the referendum is what shot it caused that issue to shoot right up to the top of businesses' concerns. And what they really want to see there is a reasonable immigration system post-Brexit that recognises that it's going to be different from the way it has been, and there isn't going to be this reliance right across all the sectors on particularly EU workers, from builders to bankers, but also doesn't turn the taps off overnight, and that is reasonable, and that recognises shortage occupations. It's not just about the high skill, high pay that we hear so much about. It is about the essential workers who are basically keeping our great capital going. And then the other side of that coin is recognising that although business has been doing a lot around skills, and actually the whole idea of apprenticeships came from business, even before the apprenticeship levy and the push from government, and the recognition by business that they can and will do more on that front. And in fact, next week, many of our members are contributing to Skills London, which is the annual jobs fair, the largest of its kind in the country, where there'll be 50,000 job opportunities on offer over a 2-day period at the Cllr Centre, and kids from London schools far and wide will be coming in with their teachers to sort of explore what the different opportunities are. So people, talent, skills, their employees, skilling them up further, bringing in new young people into the system, but also asking for continued access to global talent, because of course London is a great global city, and you can't have a great global city without great global talent. So that was the number one issue, and there's no sign of that going away. I think I would predict that that's going to stay the number one issue for a good few years yet. The second issue, where they live, obviously that's what we've heard a bit about this morning, that the housing crisis is obviously a bit of a national issue, and we're very pleased to see that coming up the political agenda now. But very much a number one issue here in London, as we saw, as Ben reminded us, and as we saw in the mayoral elections a couple of years ago. And Sadiq still talks about the fact that there are three priorities, and that's housing, and housing. Business is, it's interesting. You wouldn't perhaps think that would be a business concern, and it has been for a number of years, but it's sort of come up slowly but surely on the agenda. And obviously it's about their employees again. So all these wonderful, talented, skilled people, where are they going to live? And it used to be the case at London First that we saw that amongst, say, the big retailers or the hospitality companies, but now it includes, the big four and the banks, and all young, particularly young people. All these young, bright, young, talented people are finding it very, very difficult to find a place, make a home for themselves in London. And so business is coming together, not only to push for obviously more cash from government, more land being freed up. More commitment also by councils, particularly the outer boroughs, towards building and being pro-density, but also businesses making commitments itself to help their own employees with loans, with advice, and so on. So that's where people live. And then the final point is about how people get about. It's transport, more investment in our public transport. Obviously, there is a strategy out there. The one particular area for our members that there's a big focus on is Crossrail 2. Our members have worked very closely with London First over the last 25 years. I couldn't believe hearing that that's how long the Crossrail has been in fact, more than that, 27 years. I think London First was first formed a quarter of a century ago to sort of get behind Crossrail, the original Crossrail, when it had sort of been shunted off into the long grass with the government claiming that they didn't have the cash to support it. And so London First galvanised the business community to support the levy that would ultimately help to push that forward. And so now, with that Crossrail coming on stream next year, the big focus is on Crossrail 2 and getting the green light on that now, so that we don't have more unnecessary delays, which cost a huge amount, and we will then potentially have Crossrail 2 coming on stream in the 2030s. And the final thing I would say is that across the board, but particularly on transport, we're really conscious at London First that this is not London first, Manchester second. This is about our capital first. We don't want to cede ground to the other capital cities against whom we compete for talent, for investment, and ultimately for our competitiveness as a great global city. And we do need to do more. I think we haven't paid enough attention over the years as London First on how London is actually a capital of this country, and how is that benefit felt by people living outside of the capital, but it's still their capital. And we've, for example, joined force with the Northwest Business Leaders Group, with Northern Powerhouse, to publicly go out there and say, this is not about Crossrail 2 versus Crossrail of the North. This is both and. And we recognise that because of the economics in our capital, the business can and will step up to do more in terms of the funding, which means that government funding could go more on a percentage basis to where that business payback isn't immediately going to be there. So that's my last point, and might be a good segue over to our
Thank you, Jasmine.
member.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you. Sean, Jasmine was making the case there that this shouldn't be, London versus Manchester, although that's sometimes how the argument has been presented, certainly during the Manchester mayoral campaign by Andy Burnham, for instance. How do you see it, and how do you recognise the problems that Jasmine referred to as being kind of London's issues as Manchester issues as well?
So I stood against Andy Burnham in the mayoral campaign in Greater Manchester, and I tell you, we had a much better fight than Zach and Sadiq did. It was on policy rather than personality. But I sorted to deal with him actually. I shouldn't really say. I'm going to say it anyway. I said, so I won't make reference to the city that you're from, being Liverpool. If you don't call me young and inexperienced, and we sort of got through the whole campaign in that vein. So it was, and it's that friendly nature that is still coming through in Greater Manchester, I think. And very much looking forward to doing the London Marathon next year for the first time. So I'm going to be running the streets of this city. But I am from the north. The north is that place so government is so proud of now that they've made the Northern Powerhouse a new region. So they now refer to the Northern Powerhouse as a region. It's great to be here in London, the most southerly suburb of Greater Manchester. And enjoyed it last night. A few degrees warmer here than it is up north. It's positively tropical, almost shorts and t-shirt for me. And that's it. I've got one more joke about Manchester in a few bits. But what I wanted to sort of say to everybody today was, the question was sort of posed around, what does Manchester, Greater Manchester think of London, our capital city? And I suppose really, what do cities outside of London think of our capital city? And what I didn't want to do was just talk to you about, it's all grim up north and it's all really bad. Actually, it's a really exciting place to be in Greater Manchester at the moment. And we're learning, I think, a lot from what London has done. We need London to be successful and thriving, to be the innovator and the creator that it is today that we've seen, because that provides leadership. It provides leadership of our cities, it generates new ideas, and collectively we need to make sure that, I think governance is going to come from our cities over the years to come, and we need to very carefully make sure that we're knitting together the priorities of the capital with the priorities that we have in Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, Liverpool, Birmingham, and any other city across the country. Because if we do that, then we can have this really profoundly positive impact on our communities, and all of us are here elected to serve our communities. And so I think we look at you with admiration. We look at you with a hope, really, that the sense of achievement and pride that Londoners have that is common in communities across the UK, that we need to be able to harness that and make sure that we do things really positively. I think we also look at London, though, and we do this in Greater Manchester, for what we shouldn't do. The lessons that we can learn from what London has happened here in London over the past few decades. And I think as we go through our devolution process in Greater Manchester, the one thing that is blindingly obvious to me is that, as populations grow, as the economy gets stronger and grows as well, there are consequences to that if they're not planned for. There are consequences around congestion, there are consequences around affordability of housing in a city and availability of housing, some of the things you've been talking about here this morning. And we need to learn very quickly that those things are much more difficult to fix after they've happened than they are to do it in the first place. So we're planning in Greater Manchester about how we allow the city the space to grow, to make sure that people can feel included in growth across the city region. Greater Manchester is going to grow by 300,000 people over the next sort of 15 years. That's the equivalent of adding another borough the size of Stockport into the city region. And there's consequences for our existing community if we don't support them, and there's a responsibility, therefore, on politicians and people like me in Greater Manchester to actually take a tough political decision, to say that we're doing this because it's the right thing to do in the long term. We don't want to avoid some of those consequences. So we look to London for that as well, to look at where we can make sure that we learn lessons from mistakes that perhaps have been made. On Crossrail, HS3, I think, is what it's referred to. And I was just saying before we got on this panel that we should stop calling it HS3. We should call it Crossrail for the North, because it seems to get more traction with government if you call it Crossrail. I think we might start doing that. And I see that actually on Devolution, London yesterday, or this week, did its health and social care devolution deal. And so obviously what Manchester does today, the world does tomorrow. I'm very pleased that you are following in our footsteps on health and social care devolution, but that's something else that we need to do together. So hopefully you take from what I'm saying a message of partnership, of collaboration, and of a real desire to make sure that all of our cities, including our capital city, are thriving, I think is the view that we have of London from up north.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much.
Kru, we've had from Jasmine what business is the problems, from Sean, the ambitions and aspirations of Manchester as a city which are shared in common with other cities. But what do we need is your analysis, at the hard end of things, the sharp end of things, working out what you actually need in terms of both legislative, fiscal and other policy things in order to make it work.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to start off by just giving a bit of a context of where we sit in terms of cities in the UK versus not just London, but Manchester and others as well, but also what's happening around the world. And so the first thing, just to remind ourselves, UN has predicted that 64% of the world's population in developing nations will be living in cities by 2050. 86% of the world's population in developed nations like us will be living in cities by 2050. So urbanization and living in cities is going to be a fact of life, and it's happening in our lifetime. And I think either as businesses or as politicians or as administrators, that's something we need to plan for, I think the point that Sean made earlier. The other thing to think about is, in the context of the UK, which is highly centralised in terms of fiscal powers and what you can do as councillors compared to a lot of cities in the rest of the world, there is always a tension around austerity, there's a tension around what's available in the tax take, and therefore there's always a pressure to argue for changes in legislation, more freedoms, etc. But actually, notwithstanding that takes time. Some of the problems we're dealing with and some of the problems other cities have dealt with in the same space of time are actually quite interesting to observe. So let me give you an example on why this is important as civic leaders to think about this. By 2030, our nation's, let me give an example of India. India is building 100 cities, mega cities, by 2030. 75% of India's GDP will come from these 100 cities. These 100 cities are going to be in a stretch, in a belt between Delhi and Mumbai, and average population sizes are going to be towards 10 million inhabitants. So that's kind of a big thing happening in a shorter space of time than when the world moves. Similarly, you've seen the Chinese government announce major initiatives around what they call the Belt and Road, which will also drive major urbanization. That is not something that we should ignore, because that is the place where our cities can trade, can get talent from, the point Jasmine was making, can learn about brand new cities and how they configure and how they invest in and build services, because they will be learning from people like us who are in a much more developed state and where we need to regenerate. And so having looked at some of those cities and having looked at post-industrial cities that have been in decline and how they rebuilt themselves, we've identified that there are 7 things that you need to do if you want to thrive. And not all of them are mutually exclusive. You have to do them in tandem, and you have to plan at a higher level, at a greater level. So at city level, the first thing is to attract young wealth creators. So that's not to say we ignore the big businesses, because of course they're easy to target and they'll come and invest. But the young wealth creators are the people who have the passion, the energy, they want to run their own businesses. And in the UK, it's an important statistics because the majority of our wealth is created by SMEs. If we were to support only 7% of our SMEs to create jobs by creating links to an external trade flow outside of the UK, we will eradicate our trade deficit. So that's the power we have within our cities and with our young wealth creators. An example of how to create wealth is to create finances from abroad and other investments. And again, there is capital flows out there looking for investment. I'll give you the example of Tel Aviv. When Tel Aviv was rebuilding, it needed a quarter where it wanted to create young entrepreneurs. The city attracted $3 billion of venture capital funding to recreate a quarter, so that now what we see is Tel Aviv as a hub for economic entrepreneurship and technology skills. Now, these things haven't happened overnight. They will happen over 10, 15, 20, 30 years. But that's the kind of decisions it took in the 1970s and 80s, which is why we see the benefit today. So young wealth creators is really important. And secondly, linked to that, fundraising, whether they come from private sector, big businesses, government, venture capital, whatever the form is. I think as civic leaders need to embrace that money needs to come from other sources and complement what we do with our tax take. Physical renewal is really important. When you look at big cities that were declining in an industrial stage, and some of this applies to us as well, where we had a big decline in industries. So if you look at the city of Bilbao and Malmö, big industrial decline, but what did the civic leadership do there? They completely repositioned those cities in terms of regeneration projects, in making the point we were discussing earlier. It's not just about density, it's about green, it's about climate change and sustainability. It's about making sure transport links are in place, but also places for people to have healthy lives and therefore well-being, and redesigning parks and open spaces. And by doing that, Bilbao has reconfigured itself around the river and using its natural asset, rather than being a river that did industrial engineering. Malmö has become the destination for events. It's a place you go to for big events and parties. So culturally, they're finding an identity which complements what people want to do and be famous for in those cities. So a third thing I would point out there, physical renewal aligned to that, and also a definable aspect of a city or a quarter. What's it going to be famous for? Because you need to be famous for it on a world stage, no longer just in the country stage. Now, the trade links are really important. Whatever happens, maybe the shock we will get is the post-Brexit environment and whatever happens. But we cannot ignore the fact that our SMEs need to export, but we will, in order to grow, need to import talent. I think Jasmine made that point. And linking our cities and their economic futures to other cities, especially ones that are not yet developed, that are growing, is going to be a key success factor to drive economic growth. So we need to understand how to do that culturally and by investments. And then finally, we mustn't forget R&D. We think that's the purview of the universities, but R&D is about innovation, it's about different ways of working. And when you look at cities like Pittsburgh, again, when it went through its reformation, it had 2 big universities, and what it did was use the universities to drive a different culture of innovation and research, so it is seen as the destination globally now for technology. It's a technology hub. I don't know how many people know that, but that's where, that's where people would go. So those are the kind of 6 things that come together, but underlying all of that, and the message I think here that I've seen from abroad, strong civic leadership, strong vision, and the ability to continue the reformation through 10, 20, 30 years, irrespective of whatever your local needs are, to think more strategically and collectively and more collaboratively.
Thank you, Kru. That's great. Brilliant. Three really, really fascinating contributions. So start thinking of your questions that you want, or points that you want to make to our panel, because I'll be coming to you very shortly. Having heard that, I mean, Sean, it strikes me that the Manchester story kind of ticks a lot of the boxes, actually, in terms of the long-term civic renewal over the last 10, 20 years, certainly the City of Manchester. And in a way, you're now seeing, I mean, talking to people within the housing development world, they're coming to Manchester rather than London because London's kind of putting too many barriers in the way. I mean, what's your impression, what's your view, and maybe Jasmine wants to say a bit on this as well, about that and the way in which Manchester is benefiting from actually the fact that London's reaching a peak in terms of what developers are willing to pay into that physical regeneration?
So Greater Manchester's been collaborating with each other across the city region for longer than I've been on this planet, which is, and that to me is part of the story of Greater Manchester, which is the city leadership in particular, all that time ago, took a view that Manchester wasn't going to be a declining northern city. It was going to be something that was a lot more aspirational and positive and confident about itself. And I think, you know, you look back now and think, well, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, you can see today what that means. So we're precisely benefiting from, you know, a hot housing market here. But I think it's a case that we've, you know, positioned ourselves, you know, across different administrations, across different political compositions, across all of those things that might get in the way to say, do you know what's really important here is our city region and our people. And we're going to try and make sure that actually we're going to use our political system for what it's here to do, which is to actually take a decision. So we talk a lot about things in politics, but the one thing that defines Greater Manchester is at some point we get to a point where we're going to do this. And you know, I view my job, and maybe everyone in here, is how do you displease as few people most of the time? And so if you can do that and get to a point where, you know, the Metrolink, for example, that was done because somebody took a decision. And that's really, I think, how we're trying to benefit from, actually, if investors come to us now, they know they can do business with us.
Thanks, Sean. Jasmine, I mean, you identified the kind of the three big issues that London business has identified: people, housing, and transport. Now, it seems to me that we continue to seek real solutions in terms of the people and the transport. The really sticky one is housing, and I talked about kind of developers moving away from London to places like Manchester and Birmingham because it's an easier climate. I mean, what's your take on where we are on a housing solution in London, and what's business's view?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm hopeful that it's changing a little bit. In that, just in the last year since I've been at London First, I mean, I think that a year ago, it just felt that it was very, very intractable, and that's when, you know, our developer members and house builders and so on were sort of saying, you know what, if you make it too difficult for us here, we're off to Birmingham and Manchester and, you know, other parts of the country. And you know, I think to a certain extent you're hearing the same conversations as I am, but I mean, I think there's more recognition. Actually, it sort of helps the fact that this has been recognised as a national housing crisis now. Obviously, the 2 billion that the Prime Minister talked about at the conference speech is, you know, sounds like a lot. 2 billion. I think we all know it's, you know, by their own admission, it's 25,000 homes over a 5-year period. Which is sort of less than half of what London alone needs to be building every year. So it's a drop in the ocean. But I think what that has done, and you know, there's quite a lot of speculation now. I think we saw Sajid Javid talking about, you know, the need to be able to, I mean, the sum being talked about now is much more realistic, 50 billion. Obviously, that's not all going to come in cash, but I think, you know, pressure's building to potentially lift the cap on councils' ability to be able to borrow to build. So, I mean, we'll have to see whether this all sort of peters out in, you know, a lot of talk and not much action. But I think I'm feeling a little bit more optimistic that the message is really getting cut through that something's got to be done here. So we'll see, and we're doing everything that we can as business to get behind that.
Fantastic, fantastic. Optimism from Jasmine, this is good. Okay, who wants to make a contribution or ask a question? Okay, so in the kind of the middle of the room, there are two hands fairly close. I can see Julian and just in the row behind you. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Julian Bell, Leader of Ealing and Chair of London Council's Transport and Environment Committee. There was a very interesting article by Andrew Adonis in the Evening Standard this week, where he talked about a kind of triangle of innovation with our universities in the south, with Oxford and Cambridge and London, and then talked about how HS2 will connect in a golden arrow the south with the north, and also emphasised the point that actually our major urban centres are actually quite close compared to other countries. I just want to know from the panel, how can we work more collaboratively rather than competitively between London and the big cities up north, so that we can take advantage of those things that Andrew talked about in his article this week?
Thank you, Julian. Gentleman behind you. Yep.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, Tony McMahon, candidate in London Borough of Hackney. I've got a question sort of across the panel really, but perhaps more sort of for Kru, wondering whether, so looking at the housing crisis and looking at what we can learn from successful regeneration stories from post-industrial cities worldwide, with a specific focus on legislative solutions that might have been brought forward to address supply and housing. And then, if I can sort of bleed that question across to Jasmine and to Sean, but specifically Jasmine, in terms of what you feel businesses' sort of receptiveness might be to sharing some of their land banks, sharing's the wrong word, perhaps releasing some of their land banks to the public sector. We heard this morning that roughly 80% of the population feel in London the local authority and housing association sector is the best way to solve, at the current time, this intractable sort of problem. So be interested to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Thank you, Tony. And then another one just down here. Yep, that, perfect.
Hi, my name is John, Councillor for Hackney, and then my question is going to be to Jasmine. And wouldn't it be possible to, for this housing crisis issue, working together, collective work with the 32 councils, and at the same time building the number of the housing together and using the pension funds as a finance?
Okay, right. Well, there were some specifically directed questions there. Sean, tell us about collaboration. How do we do collaboration rather than competition? Asked Julian.
So I think it's just about being really clear about, what is the role of the capital city? What is the role of cities in the north? And the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, and we completed an economic review of the north of England that said, what are the sectoral strengths of this part of the world? Because if you do that, you stop it being about place. So it's not Liverpool against Manchester or Manchester against Leeds or Leeds against Newcastle. How does Cumbria fit into all of this? Because that's in the north too. And so we identified, I think, what our core strengths were. And I just think we just need to talk about that with London and say, right, okay, how are we going to grow? One of the key things that I think has happened recently is, you've had Transport for London here for ages. Transport for the North is on its way to getting similar powers to TfL. Those two bodies need to collaborate really strongly with each other around actually what are the transport priorities for both London and the north of England. I should say the Midlands as well, I suppose. You can't forget about them in the middle. And I suppose finally, really, in relation to, there was a lot of critics and a lot of criticism about, do we have a mayor or not? Yorkshire's grappling with this problem. Do they have a mayor or not? And one of the things, and whatever your view of that is, one of the things having a mayor does, and we deliberately didn't want London's mayoral system when we were designing Greater Manchester's mayoral system, because we didn't want to separate the combined authority from local authorities, which is clearly, I think, something that is a feature of your system here. But it does give civic voice and that leadership that Kru was referring to before. There is a real responsibility on Andy and on both Andys and the other mayors across that are in post in their respective places to behave properly and to actually have some sensible discussions about how do we collaborate, because if we do, then the potential is huge.
Okay, and there might be some thoughts about how you make sure that Transport for the North remains under your control as combined authority, as opposed to becoming some beast of its own. Not that TfL is a beast. TfL colleagues. Kru, very specific question about what have other cities done legislatively in order to tackle things like the housing crisis from Tony?
So the big difference, I think we all know, is that most of the cities, well, nearly everybody outside of the UK has greater fiscal powers in terms of their cities and governance of their cities than we do. Rather than think about what could we do to copy them, because I think that's well rehearsed, everybody knows about what we have to do there. Let me just answer the question from a slightly different perspective. So without question, in our context, supply is part of the solution, and we've heard a lot about how house builders, developers, etc., are keen to get that going. The interesting thing, I think, to reflect on is what other cities have done about designing what type of housing they want, so that the supply meets the demand. And that's about putting citizens in the heart of that design, asking for consumer choice. And the reason that's important is because you might see a situation where we're all in a rush to build lots of units, and we go and build lots of units. And if somebody listens, there may be terrace houses or there may be tower blocks, but we're not sure. And I think the way to get around that is to think about using your planning powers, your strategic planning powers as local authorities. One of the things I've seen is in Australia, where, again, slightly different setup because state has more control, but building housing for different life stages of the population. So to bring it back to life here, we have a number of people who are in larger accommodation than they need for the stage of life they're at. As a local authority, early planning of that kind of, understanding that demographic and understanding that supply that already exists, and trying to convince those people to move to smaller units for their stage of life, elderly for example, trying to make sure that you're building 3-4 bedroom places for young people who you know are going to have families. So trying to design housing supply in that way will probably assist developers. At the moment, developers make a choice about where they build based on the price they pay in an auction for a bit of land, and then they try and maximize their return by the number of units, driving density. What we need to do, I think, here is give a bit more of a flavor and guide them to where we want houses built and the type of units we want built around building communities or regenerating communities. And that will take a lot longer, but I think that's the opportunity rather than look for legislative changes.
Okay, thank you. And Jasmine, a couple of questions to you about use of pension funds and also about will business hand over its spare land?
Yes.
Well, not any spare, but its
land.
land.
The land banking and funding sources. So first of all, I mean, just to point out that London is building. So there are about 24,000 homes, new homes that got built last year. We've got
But we need 66,000.
We need 66 now. But the point is, we've got a study now with Grant Thornton that actually measures where those homes, where those planning permissions are being granted, and where they're not. And that's all publicly available. And actually, to each of you privately, you can see where your borough sits. We're not naming and shaming publicly, but privately we will show that to you. But with one or two notable exceptions, the outer boroughs simply aren't building. And the evidence doesn't seem to suggest that that is because of developers' land banking, which tends to be more in the central boroughs because that's where land value has been traditionally increasing. But so it's about sort of focusing on what the actual issues are and what's going to move the needle. I mean, I think that developers, so I've talked to our developer members about this charge of land banking. I mean, what they say is, as you could expect, is that the development business cycle does require a certain amount of pipeline. And it doesn't actually behoove them to sit on that pipeline, to have a larger pipeline than makes sense business-wise. They're not actually in the business of trying to make money on land. They're in the business of trying to build. That's their business model. There's also simultaneously quite a lot of public land that should be coming forward that isn't. So, there's a little bit of a he says, she says in terms of where's this land going to come from. And I think that our job as London First is to try and keep the pressure on both sides to make sure that that doesn't become an excuse, because we do need land. We do need the financing. The thing is, actually, there are a lot of funds out there, whether it's pension funds or, there's a lot of funds that would be totally up for, being mobilised and investing in house building. And that's why one of our areas of focus, it'd be interesting to hear what you think about this, is to lift that cap on councils to allow you to borrow to build. Because the funds are out there, but at the moment you can't access those funds because of that cap.
Thank you, Jasmine. Okay, I was a very male trio of questioners last time, so I'm going to, so lady here, lady there.
Thank you. My name is Beulah East from Hillingdon Council. You spoke briefly about SMEs. As you know, they are the sort of the ethereal blood that keeps communities alive and growing. My question is about BME's setup, and how can we support them and provide mentors for them, because they want to get on the ladder, as it were. Thank you.
Really good question. Lady there. Yep.
Thanks. Got that? Yeah. Yeah, I think housing is still the very big thing. I mean, my ward in Wandsworth is where I'm going to have lots of regeneration, and we've worked very hard over the last 3 years to make sure we took our residents with us to get what we're getting. But it is about mixing the sort of 10 years and all the rest of it. That's going fine. What really worries me is, because I live fairly near the Nine Elms, it happens to be a council estate rather than the ones on the bottom, we've got thousands of houses going up. Most of my residents can't afford, even the affordable ones, they can't afford. So it's actually not just, we're a bit in this numbers game of how many houses you stick up in the smallest, I mean, it's like Shanghai by the Sea down there at the minute. But it's actually what sort of housing, it's actually what people can afford. I mean, we've a minute, I think it's 7% down that bit now that's affordable. Yeah. And I couldn't afford one. So what do we do about that? Because actually it's all right providing buildings. Yeah. What we've got to do is houses for local residents.
Yeah. Okay, and ideally another woman, so that I'm being... Okay, we're just going to... Sorry, Nick. I'm going to be non-gender specific then.
Nick Sharman. Unfortunately not. Just to pick up on a point Sean was making, which was, well, I was lucky enough to be on a peer review up in the Manchester area. And one of the criticisms about the economic plan was that it was very much a central business district strategy, and that what we were getting was certainly some high-end jobs in the centre and some low-wage 0 hours contracts of jobs on the other. In other words, we were getting that split, and certainly some of the outer authorities in Manchester were feeling neglected. And I guess what I'm interested, because it's so much the London problem too, about access to a wide range of jobs. And unless we get that right, we won't have the sort of positive community cohesion that we've all been looking for.
Okay, great question. 3 great questions again. Sean, on that last one from Nick, how are you spreading the economic benefits across the wider district? And can I also ask you, I mean, what is the housing supply situation in Manchester? I mean, it's absolutely acute, and our colleague from Wandsworth talked about the lack of affordable housing that's coming in. Is Manchester experiencing the same, or are you meeting your demand currently? What's the position?
So across the city region, we're planning for 225,000 new homes between now and 2035, not without its challenges to do. That will be put in terms of, so we can plan for that. In terms of delivering it, we're delivering about a third of that each year at the moment, so there's a significant uplift that's needed. As I sort of said before, I think in my view housing is a political issue in this city. And not necessarily about don't build it, but how do you build it? And we need to be careful in Greater Manchester that we don't get to a point where housing is so unaffordable or unattainable, or it's the wrong type of tenure and all of that sort of stuff. And I think we're taking a view that this is not a private sector, local authority competitive thing. Actually, to get to the levels of delivery that we need, all of us are going to need to intervene in that market, and we're very, very sort of relaxed about it. And that's good for London. London's housing crisis will not be sorted by London on its own. You know, it's going to need the cities across the north and across the Midlands and elsewhere to really be firing on all cylinders to make us an attractive place to be, to try and help this city with its housing crisis. And just on that,
I don't know whether you heard from, I mean, when Ben was here, he was talking about, you know, people actually positively taking the decision not to take a job in London because they could afford to live and buy outside London. In his case, it was somebody working in Leicester.
I mean,
so,
who wouldn't want to live in Greater Manchester?
Exactly.
It's fantastic. So, and I think, you know, the renaissance of Manchester city centre over sort of 20 years, and it does get stuck, a bit of criticism about how do you make sure the outer boroughs have done that. That's the whole point, I think, of our devolution discussions with government. So when we signed the first devolution agreement in 2014, it was specifically about how do you not just sort of continue to grow our economy, but how do we get the levers that are really going to make sure that our population, our entire population, on skills and employment, it's why the health and social care devolution deal in 2015 was really important. Everybody said to us, "You're mad. Why would you take on a £2 billion deficit in your system?" It's sort of because it's going to happen anyway. So we might as well do something about it and try and say that if you're going to fix the northeastern authorities, Oldham, Tameside, Rochdale and Bury, might feel like they've been left behind. Well, we need to make sure that we don't just try and, you don't just build new things for them. You have to fundamentally change how those populations work, and that's what the very heart of our devolution discussions is designed to do. So if we can take how we grow and how we look after our community and do it together, we should be able to answer the question about making sure that everybody feels part of what we're trying to do.
okay, thanks, Sean. Kru, I want to ask you, I mean, the question from Wandsworth and about the affordability. I mean, the stat that always gets me, 1969-70, we built 380,000 homes in this country, of which 185,000 were council homes. We took that out in the mid-1980s with Mrs. Thatcher and Right to Buy, and we've never replaced it. So we carry on building about 200,000 homes, more or less, each year. It's kind of obvious, isn't it, what the problem is.
Yeah.
Is that accepted by the private sector? Are you doing your bit to say to government, come on, let councils and others build?
Certainly, as employers, I think there are two bits. I think as organisations like us who can do research and give stats, I do think that we are increasingly showing alternatives to just let the private sector or the market deal with the forces. And certainly, you know, this is an area where there does need to be some intervention in the market from government. It does need to not just allow people to borrow, but it can actually allow them to borrow against public sector rather than more commercial rates. I do think policy changes can drive a shared ownership, and it can insist on things which you can leave to local councils to do. But as employers, certainly, I mean, if I take the example of companies like us, we find it really difficult to find affordable homes for our young talent. And so, you know, what we have done is worked with the banks and made sure that they're getting preferential rates of borrowing, and then we've made sure that their salaries don't fall behind so they can afford it. But I do think, I come back to what Sean has said, this is something that we all have to own as an issue. And fundamentally, unless we're growing the economy, we can't afford to do a lot of this. So we've got to do it in parallel to jobs growth as well. But I do think this is an area where affordability of housing for certainly public sector workers requires intervention in the market, because the market has not delivered.
Yeah. Jasmine, your views on that, and also Beulah's really good question about, you know, its skills for SMEs and mentoring for SMEs, and kind of what's London First. You touched on that as an issue from London First. Is there any kind of more reassurance you can provide?
I mean, on the housing, absolutely. And what's business doing? I mean, business is both, you know, making its own moves in order to help its own employees, and we have this employers' pledge that I talked about, where we've got 120,000 employees now covered by those steps that business can do. But frankly, that's not going to build more homes. So business is also getting behind this sort of advocacy campaign, really, to try and, as I say, get this cap lifted so that there can be more intervention in the public sector. So yes, on that side, completely agree. On sort of mentoring and helping young people, and particularly sort of particular communities, because overall we have to accept, you know, we have to realise that unemployment is at an all-time low across the country, but there are real pockets, either, you know, geographic or particular parts of the community, and more needs to be done on that front. And there's a lot, I can tell you, there's a lot of concern and recognition about that across London First membership. Again, all sectors, from retail, hospitality, through to construction, professional services, you name it. And they've all got their own little cottage industries. There isn't a chief executive I don't talk to who doesn't tell me about how they've got 1,000 apprenticeships, or an outreach program to a local school or whatever. But they do recognise that these are all a little bit cottage industries, that they're not adding up to something greater than the sum of the parts, and they're quite designed, they're quite company focused. So they work for that company, but if you're a kid in that area, how do you know which company you can go to and who's got the, where the opportunities are? So that is something that we're looking at in our Skills Commission. And we are willing to do something as a convener, as London First, to maybe help that in the right direction. So I don't have the answer yet, but we definitely recognise that problem.
Thanks, Jasmine. Okay, I've neglected this side of the room. So, sir, you there? And then I can see three hands at the back, which should probably be our last round. So.
Councillor Michael Stark, London Borough of Redbridge. I spent about a week in Bilbao about a year ago, and a bit of a statement. The thing is, it is beautifully organised. The underground system is fantastic. You can get around the city beautifully. You get the headquarters, the city where city's run from, is beautiful. And yet there are new buildings, but the new buildings built by the Institute of Directors or whatever that fit in with the buildings that are there in a way that we don't seem to. And we have a local development plan where I am, but what worries me, and having done planning for over 20 years, we seem to be going to another phase of stick them up, build them high, and meet the targets, and that'll be lovely, won't it? And this has resulted in some atrocious centres in London boroughs and outside. And I'm wondering if we can't do anything to follow a sort of development like Bilbao, where they at least appear to be able to control the situation and get things that people want that look nice.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, then colleagues at the back. Yep, three hands up at the moment.
Thank you, Murad Qureshi. Can I go back to the kind of conflict between Manchester and London, if you don't mind?
There is no conflict, it's love.
We know where the Premiership's going this year. It's going up to Manchester from Chelsea this year. Although hopefully it's the red side. Seriously, I think actually I wanted to ask the question of Sean actually. Why is it that Manchester local authorities seem to be better able to manage and run their airports than London councils? I say that because we all know that Manchester Airport is fully owned by the councils of Manchester, and you even came down south audaciously and brought up Stansted whilst London Council stood here not even making a bid. Sure. So I would like to hear your views on that.
Okay, controversial. You are at a London Council's event, remember? Okay, colleague next here, and then there's final hand there.
Thank you, Linda Perks from Greenwich.
Hi, Linda.
I'm interested in this point about people and work, and one of the issues about all cities is issues about poverty, and I'm interested in what we can do about addressing this question of in-work poverty and casual employment and zero-hours contract employment, and what can we be doing to raise the level of pay, good quality employment, because that's going to obviously contribute to improvement in the economy.
Thanks, Linda. And then colleague behind you.
Councillor Adegboyega Olwale from the London Borough of Bracking and Dagenham. The apprenticeship scheme has been a very successful scheme for school pupils, but it runs short of publicity and deliverance, in the sense that many schools do not have enough placement for the children in their schools. Does the panel believe that this scheme should be rolled out into primary or medium-sized business organizations so that these children can have placement in these areas? Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I mean, that's a good range of questions there, and I'm going to start with you, Kru. That's probably going to be our last round of questions, so any closing thoughts as well. Kru, Bilbao, they've done it really well. London does it really badly. Tension between planning and delivery.
Yeah, I think the observation you make is because they had a shock and they had to redesign everything. You know, Bilbao before the redesign was highly industrial, you know, dirty. I don't think you could look at London and go, what's the shock that allows us to redesign? So I think our challenge is, or any city in the UK where it's developed, is how do you actually agree collectively what is the vision for aspects of London, either by borough, by segment, by quadrant, and then make sure you're reflecting that in your planning applications all the way through. These things have taken 20 years plus, but they had a vision set out for what they wanted the city to look like at the end of that, and they've sustained that. And I think a little bit of that is what's happened at Greater Manchester, where, you know, no longer were the Manchester authorities going to be a victim, but they had a vision for what they wanted to look like in 20, 30 years. And I think that's something London councils can probably do, GLA, London boroughs. What is that vision for London? What is it going to be famous for by quarter, by sub-region, etc.? And then that will give everybody a framework within which they know they're working towards a greater good, I think, is my point around that.
Can I just ask on apprenticeships? Obviously, the apprenticeship levy being introduced by the government, companies like KPMG introducing more apprenticeships. But in terms of the companies that you're dealing with, right down to those SMEs, you know, is it happening? Are apprenticeships being introduced and offered? Because there is a fear that the apprenticeship levy is just another bit of taxation, actually, from central government, and we're not going to see the benefit of all of it.
We're fine. So yes, organisations like us are taking on apprenticeship levy, and it is a burdensome process, and we are doing that, and we're large enough, and we can see the benefit. But I do worry about smaller organisations, SME organisations. And again, you go back to where's the growth in this economy? For every one apprenticeship an SME organisation takes over, it's going to be more impactful, potentially more sustainable. So I think there is something to be resolved. We are in a good position in the sense that we are advisors on the apprenticeship levy to clients. We understand it. We're also a provider of apprenticeships. So we work with Ofsted. We're being regulated as a service we provide. We are using that insight to help government rethink the bureaucracy around this. The worry I have is, from what I have seen of the providers, the market isn't ready for the bureaucracy. So how can you expect the employers to take advantage of this? And I think this is it's good to raise, but I think it's an issue that needs to be resolved quickly, and I don't think it's getting enough attention yet, and I think people will be trying to resolve that as part of when business starts pushing back and saying this is a burden. I can see government wanting to change, but I recognise there is a problem, the way it's been introduced, the way people aren't ready for it yet. It's not easy being an apprenticeship provider. So.
Jasmine, your thoughts on apprenticeships and the apprenticeship levy, and also that point from Linda about in-work poverty. I mean, we've seen in Southwark 40,000 new jobs over the last 7 years, but there's always going to be a concern of those well-paid jobs. You know, is it people having to take 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet? You know, what's your observation as a representative of business in our city?
Yeah, I mean, I think business would absolutely recognise both points. So our Skills Commission that we have, the John Allen, our chairman, who's also the chairman of Tesco's and Barrett's Homes, so you know he's got a large employee base there, and you know is personally very invested in trying to get some of these things to work. You know, the Skills Commission is absolutely looking at both of those issues. So you know, we're in exactly, not surprisingly, in exactly the same place on recognising that the bigger companies and some smaller companies have made the levy work for them. Many companies haven't. Part of that is a learning curve and a sort of a positive attitude, and part of it is what can be done actually as feedback to the government to make it easier. And that will be a set of recommendations that we will then take forward. We're not going to put them in a report, but we will then use our kind of lobbying power to take those forward, working with others. I think on the point around, what was the other point?
In-work poverty.
In-work poverty, yeah. I mean, and actually at the moment, the apprenticeship levy can be used for either new young people coming into the work environment and or people holding sort of lower paid at the bottom of the, or actually anywhere in their organisation, and businesses are looking at how to, and I think one of the things that will come out of our consultation is perhaps being a bit more specific about the two types. I mean, both are important, but different interventions are needed in the two types. But I think there's a real recognition. I mean, you know, I talked about hospitality and, well, let's take the hospitality sector. After the Brexit vote, we had a number of our members sort of getting together with their HR departments, and you know, we all heard about this, didn't we, in the media, in terms of various coffee shop chains, etc., saying, well, you know, we don't get young people applying for these jobs, and there's a real recognition that they need to do more. Employers need to do more to present these not just as jobs but as careers. So, you know, at the moment, you know, getting a job in a coffee shop is seen as a sort of a, you know, low-paid sort of summer job type of thing by, if that, by our own young people, whereas we've got young people coming in from around the world to take them. Whereas if it was seen as something where you can be trained up and, you know, quick succession of promotions and, you know, a career in hospitality, which other parts of the world have careers in hospitality, that might start to change minds. So really, I don't have the answers, but it is recognised, and business is, you know, grappling with these same issues in the same way as people here are.
Thanks. Sean, Murad clearly wants to be a Manchester councillor at some point. How do you do it? How are you so wonderful? And give us some thoughts on the apprenticeship levy and how that's working in Manchester as well, if you could.
Okay, so just briefly on the airport. I mean, I think when we talk about the airport, we don't talk about the airport in terms of, you know, the airport as a business itself, but it's the role the airport plays in the Greater Manchester strategy. We want to be a global, international city. You sort of need an airport to make that happen. And there is a vested interest of the local authorities, because we only own half of it now, because we got a private investor in a few years ago, which helped to finance the acquisition of Stansted. So I just think there's a framework within which we make all decisions in Greater Manchester, and that in many respects removes some of the politics. It does guide us to make those decisions in a way that is more rounded, and so we look at how, like I said, the role the airport plays, how it fits in with business, how it fits in with some of the assets and strengths that we've got in Greater Manchester. Sport, you know, we're a sporting city. We can use sport and culture to really attract people into the city region, and so that I think really is how we use the airport. And just in relation to the apprenticeship levy, I mean, I echo a lot of what Jasmine said. I mean, my view of the apprenticeship levy is it's a great idea in concept, but it's just been implemented by central government. And it comes with so many, I mean, it was ripe for a devolved type system and a bit more freedom and flexibility that we just haven't got. And so I think it's serving a purpose, but we're lobbying very hard, and I'm sure London is as well, to try and say, look, you know, this is something that really never before, in working skills policy, there's such a bank of evidence that says if you have a devolved, localised working skills system, that it will produce better outcomes, and yet we just don't appear to be making progress on it. So I think that's somewhere where we need to work together. And if I just can finish on the key question of the day, which is which team is going to win the Premiership in Manchester as it comes back north. So I've got an identical twin who's a United fan, and as we were growing up, it was the first chance I had to be different. So I'm a City fan. So so it's coming up north, and hopefully it's going to the blue side of the city.
Okay, well, colleagues, we've reached the end of this session, and so we're going to be having a lunch break now until about 1:30, when we have breakout sessions, and you should know from the programme where those room allocations are for the breakout sessions this afternoon. Please take your belongings with you, because the room will be rearranged. But can we, I thought this was a really brilliant session, and I thought that actually the fact that there's kind of unity in message is really important, because it demonstrates, be it from the private sector business or a different part of the country, the problems that we're facing and tackling are the same, and our message to government has to be the same in those circumstances. So please thank a brilliant panel, Kru Desai, Jasmine Whitbread, and of course our friend from the north, Sean Anstee.